the data that I've shown you up to this point has been for fairly large income groupings. So we've looked at the share of incomes that have been received by the top 20% of the population. But what about people with really quite high incomes? What about the top 1%? In the last 15 years or so, there's been a lot of work trying to estimate what the share of top incomes is, and in particular, what it's been in the past. And that research has largely focused on income tax records, so that one can go back perhaps about 100 years to get some sense of what share of incomes was received by, in this case, the top 1%, say back in 1920. And this work has been done by a guy named Michael Veal at McMaster University. And what he's found is this story that's illustrated here. So I'll just point out a couple of obvious features of it. You can see that the top 1% received a pretty high share of incomes that peaked, let me see, it looks like about 1936 or so. And then from the late 1930s through World War II, the share of the top 1% came down a lot, from the vicinity of sort of 16%, or sort of between 16 and 18% of total incomes, down to about 10% by the end of the war. And from the end of World War II until around 1980, you can see that that share sort of gradually trended downwards. Well, that's sort of a reflection of how the broad middle class in the country was doing relatively well. So their share of incomes were growing, and that of the top 1% was gradually declining. But we can see that something happened in the late 1970s and into the 1980s, sort of the period from about 1975 to about 1986 or so. That gradual decline stopped, and an upward climb began, which brought the top 1% back into the 12 to 14% range, a share of income not seen in a very long time. So what was causing that? Well, what these researchers did was they looked at ever smaller portions of that top 1% to ask, how are the very high income earners within the top 1% doing? And the conclusion that they reached was that this increase here was largely driven, or was sort of disproportionately driven, by an increase in the income shares of the very top income groups. So I'll just show you one more slide. Let's look at the top 10,000th of the population and look at their income shares. Again, this work was done by Mike Veal at McMaster, who for some reason has not updated this since 2010. I'm not sure why. He's part of an international research group that's looking at this sort of thing. Anyway, what's striking about this is the way in which the share of this very small group has changed over time. So again, if we go back to the 1920s and the late 1930s, we can see that the share of that top 10,000th of the population was about 1.7, 1.8% of total income. So if you pause to think about that for a minute, that's a huge share of total income relative to the size of this group. But as we saw with the top 1%, that share fell very sharply during World War II and continued to decline until again around 1980 or so, at which point it began this climb. But if you compare this slide with the previous one, you will see that this increase was much larger in proportional terms. So in these years, the share of the top 10,000 was about 0.4 of 1%. And that skyrocketed by more than 4 times. So this share here is about a quarter or less of what it became here in the early 2000s. This decline here is the financial crash of 2008. So presumably this has probably rebounded since that time. So the story here is that there's been a spectacular increase in the shares of the share of total income going to this very top group. Who do these people consist of? Well, one group that is certainly in there are what I call senior corporate bureaucrats. They're people like chief executive officers of large corporations and vice presidents of those corporations and so on. And if you look at the data for the United States, pay of senior corporate managers started to increase very rapidly at around this time. And I think there was probably a spillover effect in Canada, in part because, of course, a lot of large Canadian corporations, Canadian-based corporations, are actually owned by U.S. corporations. There's a lot of foreign ownership, in other words. Well, why should we be concerned about skyrocketing incomes at the very top like this? Well, one consequence is going to be that the very high incomes that are associated with this are not something that any normal person would be able to spend. So these people are going to be accumulating wealth. And so we would expect that very high incomes at the very top are going to lead to greater wealth inequality, which is something that we'll have a look at in a minute. I want to consider another reason why we might be concerned just about economic inequality in general. There's a Canadian economist named Miles Korak who used to work for Statistics Canada and has now become an academic. And he's made himself famous by studying an interesting question. And the question is, to what extent are the incomes of sons associated with the incomes of their fathers? And the reason that this is an interesting question is we're really asking, to what extent does a father's relative income get passed on to his son? So, in other words, if you're in the top 1%, is your son likely to be in the top 1% as well? Are you passing on that advantage? If you're not, then what that would suggest is that we've got a society in which we've got greater equality of opportunity. So we're not just a person's position in the income distribution is not simply being determined by where their parents were. So it's a question of what I call here social mobility, or opportunities that are available to people. Well, this kind of research is possible now because we've got good data, again, I think using income tax records, that allow us to connect fathers and sons and to compare them, compare their position in the income distribution at the same age. So I think the age that's usually looked at is when these people are in their 30s. So they've kind of settled down, got a steady job, and so on. So what's being measured in this picture is to look at the extent to which fathers and sons' incomes are connected. So the further we go up the vertical axis, the greater is the connection between the son's position in the income distribution with his father's. And I might add, the reason that men are being looked at here is because women's earnings and labor force participation is more complicated. So it's easier to look at what's going on with men. So that's what's being measured on this axis. It's kind of a measure of social mobility. So the further we go up here, the more closely tied are fathers and sons' incomes. And on this axis, we've got the Gini coefficient. So the larger that is, the greater the amount of income inequality. So these connections between fathers and sons' incomes have been worked out for a lot of countries, as shown by all these blue dots. Here's Canada down here. And the question that Miles Korak wanted to answer was there any connection between the extent of income inequality in the country and the extent of social mobility, as measured by this connection between fathers and sons' incomes? And so he collected and analyzed a massive amount of data and showed that indeed there was a connection. So this red line is sort of like the best statistical fit of these observations here. Those of you who've studied some statistics and know something about regression analysis will know what I'm talking about in more detail. So what is this saying? This is saying that countries with very high levels of income inequality, like these countries in Latin America, for example, also have relatively high associations between fathers and sons' places in the income distribution. In other words, there's not a lot of social mobility. The United States, as you can see, doesn't look very good in comparison with other countries, say Canada, Japan, and European countries. So let's just consider the Canadian situation. Here's the Canadian Gini coefficient, sort of in the low 30s. And the good news, I think, from a Canadian viewpoint, is that the connection between fathers and sons' incomes is pretty low, given the extent of income inequality that we've got. Of course, it's even better in places like Norway and Denmark, where income inequality is even lower. So the takeaway lesson, I guess, from this is that if one is able to reduce income inequality, perhaps you can also improve social mobility, which is desirable simply for fairness reasons. Okay, well, in the next set of slides, I want to have a look at wealth and wealth inequality.